All right, well, welcome to this Center for Process Studies seminar. This is actually largely thanks to newly minted Dr. Benjamin Chica. Yay! He successfully defended his dissertation this morning. If I understand correctly, it was the title of your dissertation, God the Created, or something like that, and dealt with both of these figures.
That's correct.
Which is one of the reasons that they're here. And I thought, well, we've got Dr. Cobb here in Claremont a lot, and we've got Bob Neville here for a brief time. Why not bring the two together to continue their theological conversations? The flyer had John with a fist up. That was just him looking fierce. It had nothing to do with any animosity toward Bob, who I think was then frightened after seeing that picture.
He tried to cancel the plane.
Yeah. He didn't have Southwest. So there's no expectation that there will be
Blood.
Yeah.
Except for the red sweater.
Yeah. But we do look forward to an exciting conversation. I think, Philip, are you okay at sort of moderating the conversation?
Yeah, because I understand you need to do the complex filming, and then he has a wedding to go to. I think it's your own, or
nope. Not this time. So anyways, with that, I welcome Benjamin Chica, Dr. Benjamin Chica, just John Cobb, Robert Bob, Cheddar Bob Neville, and Dr. Phil Clayton.
All right, welcome, and it's great to see all of you here. It's exciting. This is an encounter that's been in the making for 5 decades. It's actually been repeated several times, but there's something about this moment, as we saw earlier today, that feels special. Special enough that Bob would fly all the way out from Boston. And friends of ours, intellectuals like Wesley Wildman, will speak of the unbridgeable chasm between Boston and Claremont. And I think they're not talking about Nebraska. And Ben faced that in the beginning of the dissertation, our conversations, what was it, 1930 when you started?
Almost. Thanks.
And you've sought to bridge it in the dissertation defense, and then we actually had a chance for these two gentlemen to join in the dissertation defense, of course, after he got the doctorate degree, since we didn't want to cast any dangers on that. And whether it's bridgeable or not bridgeable, and what are the differences between these two major thinkers, is the topic of today's discussion. I would like you both to be able to make an opening statement on your own, and of whatever length, and then engage in an unmoderated dialogue. So I'd rather step back and let the discussion go, but I think Dr. Chica will want to step in at a few points, and that I really want to reserve a time that belongs just to the audience. And so I would think not much after 4 p.m., 4:10 at the latest. I understand we do need to end pretty close to 4:30, at least the broadcast does. And if there's and we'll allow people to leave who need to, but those who'd like to continue the discussion a bit are welcome to. When there's a president in the audience, you know that he probably has 6 meetings before dinner. So I want to respect. Actually, I want to acknowledge Dr. Jeffrey Kwan and give him a round of applause for his. I'm looking if there are any other presidents, but we're at, you're solo today, Jeffrey, so you'll have to represent presidency overall. Since you're the visitor, I'd like to give you the chance to open. And then John, open time of discussion, and then to invite the audience in. Sound good?
Yep.
Bob Neville.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for allowing me to come out here and meet again with John. We have been meeting now for a long time and in different places. I've spent quite a lot of time out at Claremont when I was Dean of the School of Theology at Boston University. There's lots of connections with the theological schools, and my wife spent a semester here as artist in residence, and had a big painting up in the chapel. The thought of not having the chapel is a little bit sad for me, because my sense of this campus is primarily aesthetic and secondarily intellectual.
We won't take that personally.
Those are not antithetical by any means. So. I think what what I'd like to introduce as the topic of our discussion is the question of truth. And we live in a time when there's fake news and fake truths. And one of the things that I believe Whitehead taught both John and me was the importance of vision in order to get an orientation to truth. If you take too narrow a perspective, then you don't see the other side. And it's very difficult even to make a truth claim. I believe is not the same thing as having a position with an argument that you make vulnerable to correction. Now, I want to raise this in the context of postmodernism, if I might. One of the contrasts made in the dissertation was that John is a postmodernist of a sort, and he gets to define what the sort is, and not the most common sort, postmodernist. And I'm not a postmodernist. And it seems to me that a lot of our culture has moved into postmodernism of a sort that has developed out of Europe with roots in Marxism and social theory, semiotic theory, but the European semiotic theory, which is a dyadic theory of signifier and signified, as opposed to a Peircean pragmatic theory, which is triadic of sign, object, and interpreted. And there are many strands of postmodernism, and I'm getting myself in trouble by trying to characterize them. But one of the characteristics is the insistence on focusing on a local context, usually with a liberative theme, liberation theology of one sort or another, that insists on taking the cultivated self-understanding of the people under consideration, the group, as setting the categories. And accompanying this is a postmodern hostility to historical generalizations, that is, large historical contextualizations, and an insistence in scholarly matters often that you write a micro-study of a close reading of a text or two or three, finding humility in not trying to speak for the other person. But I think one of the things that I learned from Whitehead is that you're not really speaking with an aim of truth unless you're trying to see things from the other person's perspective. And for that reason, you need to have large historical positions and also large philosophical theories. So Whitehead gave us one of his definitions of metaphysics, that you would need to have the categories that allow you to see the different positions as they come together. Now, Whitehead wrote in a time where it was okay for him to deal with the history of Western civilization and make odd remarks about other civilizations. I'm sure he would agree with, I think, John and me, nowadays, that we need to be able to articulate perspectives of East Asian and South Asian and Muslim civilizations and the civilizations of Africa and indigenous people in various places. We don't do that very well, but at least in my work, I aim at that. So I'm very anxious to be able to cultivate a philosophic perspective, which includes a theological perspective that is sensitive to many different ways of engaging in communication. Standing against that, I take it, is a lot of postmodernism that rejects the large philosophic perspective and historical perspective. Of course, those could be misgeneralizations. Our philosophical schemes need correction always. But as a fallibilist, I think that all positions need to be corrected. And you make progress by making a claim and correcting it and finding other people who bring perspectives that you distort. So I would say that we should practice our philosophical theology and associated things, including ethical programs. We should practice that in a comparative mode, where we learn how to register as much as we can, admitting that we're always biased and historically located and so forth, but as much as we can, the perspectives of others that would be then internal to the philosophic position we use as an orientation. Does that make sense to you?
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Thank you. So, all right. Well, I'd say something first directly related to that and then back up to what I was going to say more generally. What I have taken, I think we're very similar on this as many things, although usually when we are both talked about or talking with each other, we zip right to why we disagree. You know how that is. But that's because we're both Methodist preachers, and just there's a lot similar in our genes.
That's right, that's right.
So on the great majority of topics, we can work together. And on this, I would say I think my task as a Christian theologian in relation to what he was saying is to try to formulate Christian theology in a way that members of other communities would not have to reject what I'm saying. That doesn't mean that they would become Christian, but I would like to talk about God in a way that could be accepted by a Muslim or a Jew, and that's not too difficult, but could also be accepted by a Buddhist or a Hindu. And I would like to say things about Jesus that could be agreed to by Muslims and so forth and so on. That doesn't mean I'm saying what I expect them to say. I just mean it doesn't have to flatly contradict. What I try to avoid is flat contradictions. Flat contradictions really make what I would call a healthy pluralism impossible. And I think one can express, I'm not talking about agreeing with all the negations that you find in other traditions. I'm talking about the heart of those traditions, what they really care about. I usually can believe that they're right. Okay. Then the question is, if you believe that Buddhists are right in what they're saying, you believe Hindus, there's so many Hindu schools, but I think you understand generally what I mean. So I hope we can get past the point of if they are right, then we are wrong. But that doesn't mean we'll all agree. There are people who, even between the two of us, I just put it very briefly, the question that preoccupies him, and Ben said it was the one that preoccupied him, I think it's interesting, but it sure doesn't preoccupy me. So that we are preoccupied with different questions is not a contradiction. It's a statement about our sense of who we are and what we are called. I'm going to use my calling language.
Right.
What we are called to do and be. And I think he's probably called to be preoccupied with that question. And although I am not the scholar to make some kind of reliable judgment, he probably has made genuinely creative advances in relationship to what has been said about that topic in the past. And I think that's, not a minor matter. This is an issue that's been very important in the history of Christianity, at least since Thomas. And if you can advance a discussion of something like that, that's something you can write on your gravestone. So the fact that we are definitely different on this, that my sense of what is critically important for Christians is different from what his sense of what is critically important for Christians, doesn't mean flat contradict, just means we do different things. And I don't want to reduce difference. I think difference is very important for the richness of the whole. But let me just quickly go back to the debate, okay? I became central in some ways to the one part of the process community by establishing the Center for Process Study. Now, probably the original discussion was before the center was established, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yes, okay. But in any case, the circle that we had in mind when we established that was a theistic circle, broadly stated. And we got along well with each other. We there were great differences, even within what is now being called the Caldwell family. There were empiricists and rationalists and speculators. I consider myself a speculative Whiteheadian.
Right.
And so this is not a totally homogeneous group, but those differences didn't bother us particularly. Again, it's not a matter of if one's right, the other's wrong. It's a matter that one approach is really fruitful and reliable and others are not so. Okay, not as much so at least. But then the book was written by another person who was also very competent in Whitehead, very much influenced by Whitehead, who pointed out very clearly, rigorously, that no two of us agreed about what God is, and that none of us really made sense of it. Okay, well, that was not appreciated, you know. As I say, we went, that we didn't all agree was okay, but this really seemed to pull the rug out from all of us. And so we interacted with Bob about this, and I think it didn't help a great deal, but we certainly had to recognize that the topic of God was not one that had been neatly resolved and worked out and wrapped up and dealt with. And probably each of us sort of thought, you know, well, the way I'm doing it, that will eventually work out a little better. But it was a very shattering experience, which is a very good experience. I hope you understand, I'm not criticizing him for this. I'm just admitting that he really got under the skin of all of us. And that's a good thing to do.
Did you name the book for those who don't name it? Who don't know?
I can't name anybody or anything, but
Creativity in God.
creativity in God. Thanks, yes.
That was
That was a very early book of mine, consisting mainly of reviews of books written by you and Schubert Ogden and several others.
Was it
And there was a
early
session
70s
at
or
the,
late
excuse me?
70s? Late 70s or early?
Early 70s.
Early 70s.
Early 70s, yes. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but I thought the audience might.
Yeah. Well, so the problem was that, you see, whereas most of the criticisms that we received were by people who didn't understand Whitehead, and we could just sort of dismiss them. We couldn't dismiss him. And I think that has had a permanent effect on the history of Claremont. Yeah. And I thank you for it, but you will also understand that it was not a happy thank you. Okay. Well, and I think that it is absolutely correct to say that to this day, there is certainly no Whiteheadian account of God that doesn't have problems. Yeah. Of course, I don't think there's any account of God that doesn't have problems, period. Right. So, but we were inclined to emphasize that Whitehead solved a lot of the problems, you see. And then to be told, no, we haven't gotten there either. Well, he was right, he was correct, but not. We thought historically it wasn't quite time for that yet. We were still trying to get our voice heard in a community which had doctrines of God that we considered dangerous, damaging, and we all agreed on some of those things. So that was that kind of. But this is a background to say why we are set up as over against each other, when in fact we are, you know, in a broader sense, we're all part of we are part of all the same family. And I don't even know I think we've made a little progress. Different ones of us have made a little progress in dealing with the issues that he was raising. But what unites us is not those issues. Yeah. What unites us are, I would say a lot of things, but probably the most important is the understanding of divine power. Because we felt that the doctrine of omniscience, that God controls everything or can control everything, that it's modified just a little bit, was doing enormous harm within the life of the church and within the world. And so we had a kind of crusade going here, and the rug was pulled out from under us. And so there has been that kind of, I hope animus is a little too strong, but you know what I mean. Okay, this is simply to explain the background of the juxtaposition of the two. Not that he is defending a doctrine of divine omnipotence, but his understanding of divine power is very different from the one that I think united the Claremont group, if we're going to call it the Claremont and the Boston group. But my own way of going about this thing is, actually, there is almost no topic on which I can make statements that are not problematic and uncertain. If I talk about what a person is, I've never found any account of a human person that doesn't have problematic elements, but that doesn't make me give up the view that there are human persons and that we should take human persons seriously. I think there is no doctrine of gravity that is unproblematic at the present time, but I hope most of you pay attention to gravity and take it seriously. So that's the way I can reconcile myself to the accuracy of his statement that I have not come up with a doctrine that coherently and adequately solves all the problems about God. But that has led me to think that, okay, let's let that one lie. If he can understand why, I say that's not a reason for me to stop talking about God and to stop talking about the nature of the way God works in the world, et cetera, which is what is the most important part of the doctrine of God. To me, even though I can't answer every question that he raised, incidentally, he's a far more learned and better philosopher than I am. I mean, no, philosophy was never really my field, although at one time I almost decided that was what I needed to make my field. If I had, I think I could discuss some of these topics with him better. So I'm willing to argue with you about philosophy, but I think you'll win most of the arguments, especially if they have an historical dimension, because you've read so much philosophy, so much more carefully than I. So my deeper commitments are to what I think is doing the will of God in the world. And I think it makes a lot of difference how we think about God as to how we will try to do God's will in the world. So it's not that I'm belittling the doctrine of God as such. And I'm pleased to find that when we get to this topic, although Bob will not see the relationship of God and the social and political and economic issues that I think are so important, and that I've spent a lot more time reading on and so forth in recent years than I have on strict philosophy. That he gets to much the same place, and I think that has something to do with the way we were brought up.
Very similar.
Probably our deepest values are pretty well shaped by the time we are 6. And my theological problems had not begun at that time.
Right.
And yours hadn't either, yeah. So I find that we can cooperate on all kinds of issues, even if we don't think of the relation of God to what is going on in quite the same way. And that when he articulates it fully, they get a little closer. I mean, I don't, people are, Thomas Aquinas thought of God both as being itself and the supreme being. And he thought both were possible, that you could see, make both statements that made sense. And I think that the Catholic Church still, the standard Thomism still tries to do that. But in the last at least 100 years, maybe a little longer than that, I don't know, you probably know that history like you know so many things better than I. But if you really think about it, being itself is not a being. That's what can be made very clear. And a being cannot be being itself. So I find within Christianity that after Thomas, a mystical tendency developed around the being itself theme, and the kind of standard piety of the church developed around the supreme being theme. And that really, I don't think my view is both are perfectly fine. I'm all for mystic, but I don't, my understanding of Christianity is it allows for mysticism if that's your thing, but that is not what the gospel is essentially about. And so I'm on the side of what I think the gospel is essentially about. He manages, despite taking the theme that should lead to mysticism, to concern himself with the issues that I think are most important. So you'll see that the relationship is not simple opposition, but a much more complicated interweaving that is based on our biographies, but also on theological judgments of what is most important in our heritage, and existential judgments, what is most interesting and significant.
Maybe I could elaborate a little bit on that.
It's your turn.
I think the contest between us is just what John has said, that he believes that God should be represented primarily as a being with intention, will, and the call to give orientation to the Christian life and others. Whereas Thomas Aquinas argued that God cannot be a being in the sense of being in a genus, and that God is being itself, and for him, being itself meant the fullness of actuality. And you could call God a being by analogy with saying that this water bottle has some actuality, and it's a thing, but God has infinite actuality. So in that analogical sense, God was a being. Now, in the tradition of saying that God is the ground of beings, or being itself, but not a being, there are two main branches. One of them comes from Neoplatonism, that says that God is the fullness of being, and the created world is actualities that have limitations. So it's the fullness of being delimited or contracted. And Thomas Aquinas, picking up from Pseudo-Dionysius, says much the same thing, but in the language of Aristotle and actuality. The other tradition is the creation ex nihilo tradition, of which there are very few serious representatives. Descartes is one, and I'm another, that says that creation is the making of novel, positive reality, not the diminishment of infinite reality in God, but the creation of novel things. I agree a lot with Whitehead in describing what the world is, but think that the analysis should start off dealing with the question of what it means to be determinate. And if God is the creator, is the act that creates determinate things, then God is conditioned by whatever the conditions are for determinate things. And so I would say that to be determinate is to have a form. It's to have many parts that are formed together. It's to relate to the other things with respect to which a thing is determinate, so as to have an existential location relative to other people particularly. But as John points out, now we have to relate to the environment that goes way beyond any kind of personal interrelations, and the achievement of the value of getting these components of a harmony together with this form and this place relative to other things. So I would say that the term God in the Western tradition refers to the ontological act that creates, but we've got to have metaphors for how to do that. Thomas Aquinas used analogical metaphors. St. Augustine had different kinds of metaphors. But in the long run, all those metaphors have to be broken, because the act of creation does not have a character. What's created has a character. And what's created is a world that has possibilities, different possibilities with alternative values and problems of integration of the self and so forth. In South Asian traditions, like Hinduisms and Buddhisms, Jainism and others, they start off with common human experience, that of being conscious, but say the reality from which things spring is like a purified consciousness. So I could practice sitting, well, when my legs were more limber, I could sit in the lotus position and meditate and clear my mind for a fraction of a second or so forth. Real good meditators can have the experience of that. And that kind of pure consciousness is Atman, and that kind of pure consciousness is Brahman, and so on down. And for both Buddhism and Hinduism, in often diametrically opposed ways, it's the agency that the Western traditions attribute to a God who acts and wills and desires and so forth. That's the cause of bondage or whatever. The answer to which is enlightenment about what's really real, which is not a person in the ancient sense, but what they take to be most important in personhood. And in the Chinese traditions, particularly Confucianism, which is anti-superstitious and pretty unmusical with regard to symbols, but also in Taoism and in some developed forms of Chinese Buddhism. The personal metaphors drop out, and things like spontaneous emergence become important. And so God is the Tao that cannot be named, and that's not much of a person, and it doesn't give much direction. So I would claim that the model of God as not modelable, because it's a pure act of making something positive, is truer to the conditions of what it means to be determinate, and that we look to what is created in the world to get our orientation about what's good and what we ought to do. And in that respect, we come out in very much the same place. Mm-hmm. So, and we share Whitehead's emphasis on the relatedness of things. Mm-hmm. So the metaphors having to do with substances, I think, are not appealing to either one of us. And we pick up on those aspects of Buddhism and Hinduism and Taoism and Confucianism that emphasize connection and relatedness. So I think that's where we stand. And the question then that I would put is, well, make one more point. Mm-hmm. Not only are we Methodists, we're Methodist pietists. And I think what that means is that we pay more attention to Jesus as a person than we do to the second person of the Trinity. I'm sure we could say orthodox things when bishops are around about the Trinity. But it's the emphasis on Jesus in relation to choice and ethics, Jesus in relation to the reconciliation of the soul. Jesus, in terms of the compassion or the love of the community that goes beyond the lovely, and Jesus as the Redeemer who gives meaning to lives that are broken and fragmented in all sorts of ways. So with that emphasis on Jesus, I think we could say a lot of the same things about practical Christianity. And we both would like to be able to talk about practical Buddhism or practical Confucianism, Advaita Vedantan philosophy, and how to live in the world. It's not to say that all those traditions agree, but if you hold, as both John and I do, that there are philosophical or metaphysical categories that allow you to get a perspective on the different perspectives, then you can begin to see how Buddhism symbolizes something that emphasizes creativity. This is one of John's arguments. Whereas Christianity emphasizes the ontological creative act as if the act were a person with intentions for us. And so we can begin to make comparative judgments that way. I think both of us would say that it's not fully responsible these days to do theology without some erudition in the alternative theologies, and without a history of some effort to try to walk in the other person's footsteps.
Well, of the things you said, I think probably a major point of division, and this would be biographical, or at least I'm not sure how it worked out with you. You say in the Western tradition, the primary meaning of God has to do with creation. I think. Did you not say that?
Well, with the symbols of creation, but the symbols always have a context. So, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the divine creativity, the making, why there is a world rather than none.
Yeah. And I didn't grow up with that. So I never thought of God primarily that way, in those terms.
Well, before I was 6, when I was 5, when I was in kindergarten, one of my kindergarten friends told me that God was a person. So I went to check with my father. And in those days, I didn't criticize my father at all. And he said, no, Jesus was a person, but that God was more like light or electricity. So I had a naturalistic sense of what the metaphors are for looking at God. And so I never thought about the divine will as having content that would make the Union Army beat the Confederacy, which was the big issue when I was 6 and 7 and 8. I was raised in St. Louis.
Yeah, and he in Georgia.
I know.
No, I was actually raised in Japan,
Right.
but my parents
That's
were
right.
from Georgia,
That's
so
right.
that was
I stand corrected.
the primary thing. But I find it very difficult to see that question as being so important in Jesus or in Paul. And I think I get my Christianity more from that. I think the book of Job is the only one in which that's really so central. And to me, the book of Job is not a sort of distinctively Hebrew book. Yeah. So it may be that in much of the history of Western Christianity, you are right. That's probably why that question seems to me an interesting one, but not one that arises particularly out of reading the Bible or out of Protestant theology. Now, that, again, I'm not trying to say mine is better. Just if you want to understand, I don't think that's the way Wesley thought of God primarily.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, okay, I'm glad we don't have to argue about Wesley. We're both Methodists, so,
Right.
yeah. So I would say that my way of thinking of God is shaped by Jesus. my favorites are Jesus, Paul, and Wesley. And don't think any of them really meditated on your God.
I think Wesley did some, in his love of the patristic fathers, I think that his emphasis on mystical unity and so forth was important, but that's not the whole of it.
Yes. So I think that we're illustrating the pluralism, and from my point of view, that's perfectly okay, and we can cooperate on everything we can cooperate on, and that's really 90% of our churchmanship and other things, and say, you are focusing on one question, and I'm focusing on another question, and you think I come up with the wrong answer when I focus on the other question. In that sense, it's a little harder for you to accept what I do as acceptable than it is for me to accept what you do as acceptable.
I think
Actually, that's an interesting asymmetry, if that's true.
Mhm.
Is it true?
It depends on what you mean by accepting as acceptable, because I think that in terms of how to live the Christian life and what to do ethically beyond the Christian life,
Yeah.
I appreciate your interest in the environment and so forth.
Yeah.
We would agree. I think that we probably would have a serious imbalance with regard to that aspect of spiritual life that deals with eternity and not time. And so for me, the act of creation is eternal because what's created, among other things, are temporal differences. And to say the act of creation is eternal is not to say that it happened at the beginning, like a first cause in Thomas, or happens all at once, as totem symbol. There's no time in which the act of creation takes place, but within time, which is an abstract part of the divine life, within time, there is what's been created so far and what has not been created yet. So I think that orienting ourselves to the eternity of the divine creative act gives a spiritual context that provides a meaning for investing ourselves fully in the issues of our watch, where we try as hard as we can, but we may not win. And I think that that's one of the chief themes of the New Testament. You don't have to win to be right. And so it's, when Jesus felt abandoned by God, he said, well, still, duck if you want, but into your hands I commend my spirit. And so I think it's being able to live the temporal life with full commitment in some consciousness of the eternity of the divine creative act. And by the eternity of that, I mean that in God's creative act, the end of the act, the terminus, that which God makes, is all moments of time as their future, all moments of time as their present concrescences, and all moments of time as finished facts. And they're all together within time. Of course, we now are at the 21st of October in 2017. So a day that Ben will always remember. The eternity in which that takes place is where we really have our concrete identity, because we are related to people at all stages of our lives, and yet they all change. How are we related in eternity? Well, all those things are together, not at once. The divine life is not at once. It's not a temporal notion, but it's where all of those things are together. So I view the dynamism of the divine life as the creative act to consist in a future that's always changing because something's happening to shift the future possibilities. Every moment has its own creative contribution to make. And the past, it's fixed, but it's always being added to, so its meaning is different.
Now, how does that differ from Whitehead? I mean, almost everything you said sounded right for Whitehead, and yet you say that's what differentiates us. So I need to just focus on the difference first.
Oh, okay, I think that for Whitehead, he has no categories for talking about the eternity in which all the parts of the category of the ultimate are together. And so I think that he does not ask the question of ontological
Yeah.
principle
Yeah.
with regard to the plurality of the temporal process, assuming that what the category of the ultimate is that whenever there's a multiplicity, creativity makes it such that there's one more that unifies that multiplicity, that adds to the multiplicity, so you need to have another one that unifies that multiplicity.
Yeah.
That's it.
No, but I was thinking, the consequent nature of God does a lot of the things that you were talking about. But,
Yes, yes,
and it's the contrast
Right.
between one who feels that's happening in the consequent nature of
Right.
God and your feeling, and why those feelings would be so different is what I didn't.
the consequent nature of God is still temporal.
Yes,
And
but,
so
but I don't see what's wrong with that, because it's also everlasting.
Yes, but in terms of being temporal, it needs to be grounded in that which distinguishes what has happened from what's happening from what's not yet.
That's
And
right.
that is where
And
eternity
it's
lies.
important to you to feel that ultimately there is no distinction between what has already happened and what will happen.
No, each moment has the indeterminacy of the future,
Yeah.
partial indeterminacy.
Yeah.
Each
So
moment has.
We agree about each moment.
Right, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So what is it we disagree about? I mean,
the-
it's true that I think that the difference between past and future is a kind of, is not an overcomable difference.
Mhm.
And is that the difference that you think it's ultimately at the deepest level overcome? And why is that important?
I think that it's, in my book, Eternity and Time's Flow, I criticize Whitehead for not being clear about the togetherness of the past, present, and future, apart from being apprehended in the present of God. And so, in a sense, I've heard you say this too, that, in one sense, only the present's real, and the past is real insofar as it's prehended into the present, and the future is an intended superject of some sort.
I think probably you haven't heard me say that, but it is often said.
Yeah, well, maybe I just heard it attributed to you, so you don't have only friends. So, I think.
No, I think there's a vast amount of the past that remains actual, even though it is not being reenacted in any part
That's
of the
good.
present,
That's good.
except in the divine life.
Yes.
So,
If that's a pause, it might be interesting to ask Ben if he wants to throw out a question,
yeah.
since he's thought more about the two of you than you probably thought about yourselves.
Well, I'm actually, the way this conversation's been going, you've actually both taken some lengths to state how you could accept each other's differences, or we're close to the same position, but we differ here, but that's okay. So, John, you mentioned how when the Center for Process Studies was started, it had a kind of theistic focus, and since obviously you do lots of interreligious work, Bob has done a lot of the same. I'm curious, this is my experience both being a master's student at BU, and then coming to Claremont for my doctoral work, and then moving back to Boston and being part of doctoral seminars there. There's still lots of talk about kind of Boston School and the Claremont School. And the Boston people, some of them would describe themselves as process thinkers. A lot of them use Whitehead to some extent.
Exactly.
They do interreligious work, but they don't feel like they're included because they're not exclusively Whiteheadians. It's a resource, but they don't use Whitehead as much as the process folk. And vice versa, maybe the pragmatists at BU don't use, they're pragmatists, these aren't process. So my question to both of you is, would you include Bob in the process theology family loosely defined? And Bob, would you accept Cobb into the pragmatist family loosely defined? Because those were real exclusive categories even just 10 years ago and just talking to people in grad school.
Well, there have been people who have been part of our family who have not been theists. I think that's a matter of sort of choice and attitude. I mean, Donald Sherburne had a whole program, Whitehead Without God, but he was still part of us. I mean, just in terms of the psychology and culture. Frankly, we accept anybody who wants to be a part of us. We don't have any, I don't remember ever kicking anybody out. But nevertheless, we do exist as, I mean, the Center for Process Studies is part of a school of theology. And of course, schools of theology don't have to be theistic anymore. But probably the fact that I'm a strong theist has had a lot to do with with the fact that it has that reputation. I have been disappointed, even when we talk about people who are very clearly Whiteheadians, that this division, which at one time was a part of an ongoing interdiscussion, has just meant there's a group that won't even have anything to do with the International Whitehead conferences, even though they are by no means run by the Center. So somehow, because we played a role in starting it, therefore they won't have anything to do. I think that's too bad. I don't know what to do about it, but certainly anyone would be welcome at those meetings, and there's no requirement of being a theist.
Have there been pragmatists who were part of the Claremont discussion?
Well, you understand this word is difficult for me since I consider myself a pragmatist.
Okay.
And I don't quite understand if being a pragmatist means being a non-theist.
Right.
So, but I don't know why it should. I mean,
Okay,
James
fair enough.
and Peirce,
Both
I mean, the people you cite are. So what is the issue of pragmatism that you think would be a problem
Okay.
at the Center?
So that's-
I really don't understand.
Yeah, so that's a really helpful answer to Vin's question. What's it look like from the East Coast?
Well, back when I published that book, we had the discussion at the AAR.
Yeah,
You accused me of being not a theist.
yes.
And I was upset at the time, since
Well,
I thought that I was a theist, and Tillich was a theist, and I wasn't any worse than he was. But then I've come over the years to think that you're probably right. The sense in which you mean theism is a finite, definite God with will, as described in many parts of the Bible.
Purpose is what I
Yeah,
would especially
purposes,
say.
that's right,
No,
that's right.
I don't object to will.
Yeah. And I think that that's just one symbolic way of getting at the ontological creative act. And you can get wholly non-purposive metaphors from China and get consciousness metaphors from South Asia. So in my book Ultimates, which came out 2013 or something like that, which is a remake and fixing up of some of my early work, I say on the first or second page, this is not a theism. The theism is one set of metaphors for giving religious content and orientation to the ontological creative act. Now, I say that I am a Christian, and I use those metaphors. And I wrote a Christology, Symbols of Jesus, and the first
Excuse me,
chapter of that.
I hope I never said you weren't a Christian.
Oh, no. The question of theism, I think, is one of language. Should it be restricted
Of
to
course.
belief in a being with intentions, which is a common view and yours, or is it much more general, having to do with the creation of the world, or the raising of dharmas in consciousness, the cultivation of consciousness, or whatever.
So, would Tillich want to call himself a theist? I didn't think so.
He did, except that he always then would say, but I believe in the God beyond gods.
Yes.
The God beyond any
Uh-huh.
definite God, so.
Okay.
But he took the language of theism very seriously, and he claimed to be an Augustinian as opposed to a Thomist. And he claimed that
Well, what language should I use? A personalistic theist, or do I have to use something like that?
That would-
The
that would-
distinction?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I'm bothered by it because the word person has so many connotations that I don't want.
So there's something in between. There's personalistic theism, there's, can we count it?
I don't have to be called a theist, but then, I
I'm sorry, there
think,
seems like there might be three here, and it might focus the discussion if we could name them and then see how neither of you fit in either one of the categories.
Yeah.
But personalistic theism, which that would serve to define you, but John doesn't like the term. There's something, the divine without purpose, that would separate you guys as well. And then there's something in the middle, John, that you're looking for that isn't personalistic, but retains purpose. That's what I'm trying to understand what that would be.
Well, I don't know what language can be used because different communities hear words in
Right,
such
yeah.
different ways. I consider that God is a subject,
and I would not.
and you would not. So, but does that mean we should say subjective? I mean, then the word subjective has a connotation in that usage that wouldn't work. But if you can help me, I'll be glad.
So
But
it's interesting, there are nouns or adjectives, no, mostly nouns, that we can say, okay, then given that, we disagree. But it's not as if I can see a position in the dialogue that both of you would hold, except to say, I don't affirm this noun, I do. It would be great for the tape if we could find some way where you had more than the nouns to describe the difference. I think a lot of us are really interested in the difference.
for Whitehead, to be is to be an active experience.
That's right.
And that which is not an active experience is not an actuality. And I believe God is an actuality.
Right. And I would say that God is not.
And you would say God is not.
God is not a being, right?
So we could talk about, is God actual? But I think that would be misunderstood. I mean, if I said, Bob thinks God is not actual, and I believe God is actual, a lot of people would think you were just an atheist.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to avoid.
So I know how to put the question. What do you think, John, is the best way to describe your position in the way that brings, as broadly understandable as possible, in a way that brings out why that's not identical with Bob's? And what's the best way to describe your position in a way that's broadly acceptable that helps people understand why it's not John's? Is that a fair question, John?
It's perfectly fair, and I really thought the term theist had the right connotations, but
But it hasn't worked for some decades.
I think the great majority of the Whiteheadians, who I say are not theists, agree with me that they are not theists. So Bob is a very special case here. But he said he's come around to not caring about that term.
Not so much, not so much.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. I think the one thing that has not been talked about, then we've got a question from the audience.
Great. I'm going to let Ben jump in one more time, and then let's go to the audience.
The thing that's not been talked about, and that Ben in his dissertation explicitly rejects, is the very great truth and importance of the symbolic character of religious language and life. I think that all religions, but Christianity in particular, are very musical. That we use symbols in ways that, of course, we don't mean literally, but we do know what we mean. When we say that God is the rock of our salvation, that doesn't mean you should get a department of geology in your theological school studying rocks. And nobody's confused about that. When you say that God is the Lord, well, that's a political term. Often you don't have to think that God is going to be the President of the United States. On the other hand, there are metaphorical connotations that politicize God as the creator of the universe, as a king runs a country. And so I think that one of the most important things that theology needs to do is to play off being as metaphysically literal as we can be, at the same time that we indicate how the symbols play musically. That's why I think it's really good for Christians to use personal symbols for God, so long as they don't take them literally and say, well, I know the will of God, and the will of God is to beat the Canaanites or whoever you're supposed to beat up. And it's perfectly fine. You get different aspects of ultimate reality come out when you use the Chinese metaphors. Different aspects come out when you use the South Asian metaphors of consciousness. And of course, each one of those systems is complex. The Hindus and Buddhists are famous for disputing with one another, but they share the common sense that the underlying stratum is consciousness, and the Buddhists say, well, interestingly enough, that's empty.
Well, a part of the difference would be, of course, that I think some terms are at least as literal when applied to God as when applied to human beings, that he would say,
That's right, that's the,
don't fit that at all. That's where the difference, I mean, obviously, we all know symbols are important. Maybe we don't make enough of it, but that most of the language we sing and pray and teach is symbolic, and of course, a lot of the language we use about each other is
Right.
also
That's right,
symbolic.
right.
It's not only God that, but to me, say compassion, I believe that God has compassion for absolutely everything, that is, feels with, and to me, that's important. And I believe that God aims at and purposes an increase of value in the world. And to me, that's important. So I think that those are the places.
Those are realtors, yeah.
And if you want to call that personalistic, I don't object to accept it. It's so hard for human beings to distinguish personalistic from anthropomorphic.
Yeah.
And so I'm willing, but I just know that other people would rush into images that
Whereas I would regard that philosophically as a category mistake. God doesn't have compassion, although God creates a world in which everything else ought to have compassion, and He's sentient beings. And God doesn't have.
I understand. I think we understand.
That's right. Yeah.
That I believe God is love, and
Yeah, right.
you think that's a symbol that.
Okay, Ben, last question, and then a lot of people in the audience want to jump in.
So I'm just, along these same lines, I'm going to try two different, if theism and personalistic theism aren't quite right, I'm going to give two alternatives to see what you make of them. Intentionality and purpose. And I'm thinking of even some naturalists and biologists are willing to use those terms for very automatic physical processes. You could say, what is the people might speak of the purpose of the heart is to pump blood, but it does so completely 100% causally determined. So it's not necessarily tied to everything that talking of a person might lead you astray or bring in lots of assumptions. So intentionality and purpose might be the middle ground, or towards the middle ground we were looking at.
Okay. Do the two of you want to respond, or just let that sit, or?
Well, I don't. I mean, it's sufficiently ambiguous that we might both say, both use the language, but I'm just not particularly interested in introducing ambiguity in order to make us use the same language.
Yeah, okay,
I think
so-
clarity is more important.
All right, let's go, and I'm going to just move around in a circle first, but I do want to do young and old, male and female, and make sure that we got a wide variety of responses. So let's do John, Garem, and Andrew.
This is just reframing the discussion. John, you mentioned about the gospel being important to you. So I'm going to ask both of you, what is the gospel for you, and what does God and what does Jesus have to do with it? If that's okay.
Of course, well, we're at a seminary, so that's.
What is the gospel? Yes, I think we have to say at different times the gospel may be worded better. Because if I try to say it in a universal way, it would be so abstract. I think the gospel that Jesus preached was that there is an alternative to the major two political options in Israel. And that gospel would be total devotion to God. And that would Well, but I'm worried about getting off to. I think that the central gospel, it's Paul's gospel has many features to it, but that through Jesus we have become children of God and not slaves. It's certainly one way to speak of his gospel. Today, I would say that the gospel is that God is working for the salvation of the planet and invites us to join.
Great.
And so I hope there's a commonality. All the way through, it is a notion that there are possibilities that we can participate in the actualization of. And when we do that, we are working with God.
Good, thanks. Well,
That's a very complicated question because it assumes there's the gospel. I share all of John's qualifications about that. I would say something like this, that Jesus' gospel is that although we think that we're living in the world, pushing the world's agenda, we really are living in God's creation. And we should be devoted to God rather than to our own interests in the world. But that means then you have to look at the world to see what we should do. And so Jesus said to be just. And there were issues of justice peculiar to his time. We might have different ones. Jesus said be healed, be whole. And so how do we attain wholeness? Depends on what our components are, and we might disagree with the first century about that. Jesus said to love all the people in God's creation. He had more people than the rest of the environment, but I would press that issue. And I think that John is right in saying that the meaning of life is to be devoted to God, and whatever that means for our position in the world. And it doesn't mean that we have to win. It doesn't mean that we have to get rich. Although it's good to have money if you're going to have to pay for a doctor. So.
Kieran.
Hi. I have a question that's a little bit on a different gear. So both of you are theologians that have dealt with the issue of religious pluralism, or otherwise considered as the religious other. So could you highlight perhaps the differences in your approaches to doing comparative scholarship in religion or comparative theology? And what are some aspects of your approach that you can admit has some limitations to addressing maybe more contemporary scholarship, such as, I would say, post-structuralist or post-colonial critical lenses?
Why don't you start this time and then we'll put John second.
Okay. I'm totally against that approach because it seems to me to obscure the real discussions, and it puts our understanding of other religions into the dialectic of post-colonialism, which is a way of being really colonialistic about them. No Buddhist or no Confucian would want to enter as a victim of Western colonialism. That's different. Rather, I think, and this goes back to something we discussed, perhaps it was this morning, briefly, whether there is such a thing as religion. And I think that as a heuristic intellectual device, we should define religion as the human engagement of ultimacy, ultimate reality, in cognitive and in existentially self-defining and in practical ways, like how to live ritually and so forth. So the engagement of ultimacy. That means that we've got to be able to give an account of ultimacy, and we can do that philosophically, but we do that through the philosophies that come from the various religious traditions, so that we can register differences and account for a real religious pluralism. We don't want to assume that religions are all saying the same thing and so forth. John Hick comes close to saying that. We don't know. It's an empirical question, how religions agree and disagree. So the Hindus tend to say the ultimate reality is some extremely full, something like consciousness. And the Buddhists say that's what it would be, but there isn't anything like that. And so we need to learn to watch the dharmas rise and cease. That's seems to me is a real difference. And you can register that only if you can if you can triangulate in philosophically to be able to articulate ultimacy. There's another side to that question. If you ask a sociologist what religion is, the sociologist will say it's what sociologists measure. It's belonging to organizations, and you get issues of membership and so forth. Ask a psychologist, they'll say, oh, it has to do with the depths of the soul. Or if you're a psychologist that doesn't believe in deep souls with behavioristic training and so forth. Religion involves many, many, many dimensions of life. And it's real as religion when they harmonize so that there is real engagement of ultimacy. Lots of times you've got those things like churches that don't have much of anything to do with ultimacy anymore. Then a political analysis or a social analysis will be far more important than a theological analysis. So it's incumbent upon philosophical theologians to try to keep track of when it is that the harmony of all these institutions and dimensions of life really involves engaging with ultimacy. The languages for that come from the traditions, but our languages are highly poetic. And so we've got a mixture of traditions now that provide our languages.
As the speaking list gets longer, I'll ask you to be a little shorter.
I'm sorry.
That's right, because everyone has a question, it turns out. I can see their hands.
Well, probably he puts more emphasis on religion than I do. So that would be perhaps a difference. I wrote a book which is named Spiritual Bankruptcy, and I depicted religiousness as a characteristic. I mean, that is very ambiguous, and that it can have a positive role, but that it can also distract attention from the real issues of life. And it tends to put something in a kind of absolute condition where it cannot be criticized any longer, and so forth. So the characteristics I described are dangerous ones. And then I said, and then the secularism, and that is, well, I think you can sort of guess what I mean by that. And I advocated the secularization of tradition as being the healthy mode. I don't think I better take any more time, but I just mean that's the way I've dealt with your question, and I'll mention it if you want to.
You're a Chilikian there. Yes.
Yeah.
So I see Andrew and Richard, and then I want to see if there's anyone over 45 or not male identified. So to put in after Richard. Somebody, is that a hand? I saw your hand move. No? And we also have a number of alums and
Over 45
advisors,
and what? Over 45 and what?
and not male.
Not male.
We have a new politically correct way to put it, but
That leaves us out.
going once, going twice? All right, we'll put Moses in afterwards. Andrew.
Thank you. Back to the question of whether or not we can speak of God as personal, or whether some personality as such is it's found in the universe. So one way the question is framed is whether or not ultimacy or the ontological act or God can be anything less than the personal when there is a universe that contains the personal. So I would be interested to see just a brief response perhaps from both of you.
So, well, that would be to Bob primarily, because
Yeah.
I would say that God creates a world in which there are persons, at least persons, if not more than persons. But does that make God a person? Well, if you identify an agent by what the agent does, I suppose, yes. And God would be cosmic gases, God would be big bangs, and all of those things. If you're hierarchical and think that persons are the best things in the universe, or follow the account in Genesis, then I suppose that you might want to say that God is personal. But God also would be expanding gases. God might be the if the universe clumps back together in a big crunch as opposed to a big bang, that would be God too. I don't think we know enough about the universe to characterize God as an agent creator, as having any particular characteristics yet.
Did you have a follow-up? Are you happy?
No, that's fine, thank you.
Richard?
So my question's also for Bob. You reject the idea that God loves in any sort of literal sense.
Excuse me?
Do I understand you right, that you reject the idea that God loves in any kind of literal sense?
It depends on what you mean by love. If you mean intentional contemplation of some poor
And you
bloke,
define it how you want. And you tell me if there's any sense in which.
oh yeah, making good things. To love is to make something good, or make something that exists better. And in that sense, I would say that the ontological act of creation, because it makes things, each one of which has goodness in itself, they can be bad for one another, but each thing is good in itself. So you could say that God is love in that sense. But if you say God is love more than God is judgment, so you need to get a loving, merciful God or something like that.
I would be more inclined to lean towards something like compassion. God is
No, I think that to ascribe intentional features to God is idolatrous. It's to make a mistake. Now, you could say that there is in the world a finite God. I mean, it could be the Whitehead's arguments, or that in order to have concrescence, you need to have a subjective unity, and that means you've got to have the action of an initial aim and so forth. So there would be a cosmos that would have a finite God in it. That's a possibility. On the other hand, the ultimate ground.
I'm happy with the finite God.
The ultimate ground of that, however, is not to be described in agential personal terms. That's what I would say.
I heard John wanting to add a
We are
quote.
closer than I thought. I mean, I thought you really excluded the possibility of a finite God.
No.
Okay,
Interesting.
thank you.
Are you happy, Richard?
Well, I had kind of a follow-up, and it was.
Actually, can you hold it, since we have so many hands, and then we'll continue after 4:30. Moses?
Yeah,
Raphael, did you want to have a question?
no, I'm still articulating.
Okay, I'm watching for your hand, so if you go ahead.
Just very
both.
briefly, I wonder what impact would your consideration of the phrase "the Logos became flesh" impacts your theism and your non-theism? In other words, if Christ or Jesus monopolized Logos, and only he embodied Logos to the exclusion of all of us, and he's simply a model for us to follow, then you could describe to God a will, a passion, as what you were saying, Richard. But if you look at it in terms of something that all of us can grasp, is the light of Logos that we can all embrace, then it becomes something more like what you're saying, as far as the Logos Christology that you mentioned to me before this meeting began. Can you comment on that?
Yes, logos, of course, is a Christian and Jewish Hellenistic term that I like. And I would say that the logos consists in the transcendental characteristics of any creation that God could make. So, and that means to have form, to have components formed, to have existential location with respect to other things with respect to which you're determinate, and to have meaning. Now, that's the metaphysics of logos. To make that a person, as I would claim, I would interpret Jesus as dealing with the human bearings of those things. And that means that for form, we face possibilities that have different values, and therefore we should choose rightly. And the whole problematic of righteousness comes out of that. With regard to being a harmony of components, Jesus did not say that we have to be consistent and that we could live with brokenness, but we could also be healed. And so I would interpret Jesus as the way that I would follow for finding wholeness of being, of a personal self. And his doctrine of compassion, love for everybody, the new commandment, is how we should relate to the rest of creation. The meaning of life is to live as a redeemed sinner before God, dealing with whatever comes up next. And so I would interpret Jesus, I separated out 4 components there, but you really should integrate those.
John, your body language was really interesting when you spoke. Do you want to add
I'm
something?
sorry, I didn't see you.
Oh, well, no, I
Was you
don't
going
know
like
what.
No, he was intrigued. He looked intrigued. And
No. I don't think this is a point that would be necessarily be too different between us. I don't think that Jesus, I mean, as I read that whole passage, first we are told that nothing is created except in and through the Logos. So that's purely an aspect of the divine, okay? If you're a Trinitarian, you can sort it out. If you have a Whiteheadian view, you can distinguish between 2 natures of God and all that kind of thing. But the Logos is not a personal being
That's right.
in heaven, but Logos is the creative working of God. And then after you talk about these other things that, for example, the human mind, that's already, the Logos is really manifest in the human mind. But when you want to get a real full presence of the Logos, you find it in Jesus, okay? I don't think that means that the Logos ceases to function in heaven and is now embodied in a single person. I don't think John meant anything like that.
good. So we have time just for a couple more questions. That puts you on the spot, Raphael. And then for Ben to make his sort of closing observation. John, then we should give you the last word as a visitor, who you came the furthest. So John Quiring.
Yeah, I heard Robert Neville say just a few moments ago that to ascribe intentional features to God is idolatry, and yet I see apophasis and cataphasis at the very end of volume 3 of your trilogy. I'm just wondering if negative theology doesn't play a larger role in your thinking than it appears to play.
Yes, well, I think that in the infinite long run, which I hope we're pretty short of yet, all of our categories will turn out to be inadequate. All of them will turn out to be idolatrous. They'll all be reflecting some kind of special interest. But we need to keep working on them. And so in the end, I say we should keep trying to improve our categories. But the existential way to live before the act of creation, to live in God's world, live in respect of the ontological act of creation, we need to keep the courage to go on, and even when our categories ultimately fail.
You don't want to hit them too hard.
No, well, not till I retire.
I'm looking for a last, oh, please. Yeah.
It's not, I'm not so sure if it's a question or a comment, but I think that one of the characteristics or elements in process, and I do not know to what extent also in your work, would be the fact that, you know, if, for instance, in classical thinking, in Christianity, God self-discloses God's self, and that self-disclosure can be cosmic, can be human, and, you know, basically what you were sharing a moment ago. And those self-disclosures are when we put it in more non-traditional terms, they could be good and evil, they could be, you know, there are many ways when we look at the cosmic unfoldings of reality, then we are grappling with those instances. For instance, for example, you have hunger, and, you know, like we've been asking these questions for quite some time. The Odyssey is one way to put it. So when we talk about the self-disclosure, then we are not considering, and you're thinking of an ultimate or the lack of an ultimate, we are not necessarily categorizing it in terms of these sort of dichotomies that we have inherited. And so I'm thinking in process terms, it's more of a kind of an ebb and a flow, and kind of polar, where there is these expressions, and then because of how we see it being self-disclosed, or we perceive it, or in some ways also prehended, then there is that notion of not able to idolatrize it or not able to make it into an idol, like you're suggesting. Am I hearing you right, or am I not quite right?
No, no. Certainly what you say about process is right. That we discover what's really important in the world. We think we discover it, then we discover that something else is important, and so there's a kind of a critical dialectic back and forth. I think we make progress. I think that we know more about what's important than we used to, but very often we get really enthusiastic about things which have a little bit of progress, but turn out to have long-term deficits. And that's why the interest in the environment is so complicated, because it really is complicated. What I would not like is the language of self-disclosure, as if God had some kind of antecedent secret that he's slowly letting out. Now Karl Barth would like that. I don't know whether you'd buy Barth any more than I would, but you'd come closer.
I wouldn't. I would come closer, but I would never use that language.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Great. So let's do our closing statements, and then we hope that there'll be an informal discussion that will continue, except Andrew will turn off the broadcast. So, Dr. Chicken.
So I just want to note what I've seen happen here. So I think too often everybody's invested in their little project, and they're all very interesting, and it's kind of anything goes, like it's all, that's a very good thing to study, that's a good thing to study. But then we look at what everybody's doing, and they're all very different and opposed, and what we've seen here, despite the fact that their careers have been debating each other, and then people, even like myself in my dissertation this morning, noting how they differ, they basically spent a lot of time realizing how much they have in common. And I am excited by that because it looks like progress in theology, whereas often theology just looks like a whole bunch of different projects, where some of their statements today have been getting over metaphysically bad or even politically dangerous models of God, that for different reasons, both Bob and John have kind of rejected classical substance theism, be it for existential political reasons or even bad metaphysics. So what I think is exciting is the chance to see similarity and difference as an encouraging model for how to do theology, where despite disagreeing on many issues, Bob and John's work is kind of bringing theology a little bit forward and saying, don't be so concerned about substance metaphysics and doing theology exactly like Aquinas did. And if you get yourself some dialogue partners that more or less agree with that, you can differ, but then that difference is kind of moving along as you keep differing, but you're leaving behind some potentially bad concepts. So that's exciting to me, and that's what I saw happen. That's
Very nicely put. Nicely put, Ben. John, what are your thoughts about what happened today? Or will happen tomorrow, or happened yesterday?
Well, I have always, I explained that our relationships began in a kind of rocky way, but even at that time, I think I really have respected and appreciated Bob's work. But I have had the feeling that what I cared about most was not particularly affected by what you cared, by how you developed what you cared about most. So I've been pleased with conversations we had last night and today, that I think in the practical world, where I'm most concerned about what we do rather than in our theories, our collaboration can go. I think it has more. I don't think I realized that Bob was quite as concerned about some of the issues that I consider important, and our conversation reassured me that that's not a problem. Okay, so that's the way I would put that.
Very nice. Bob, you get the last word.
Well, I think that intellectual life takes place best among friends. And the kinds of arguments that you can have can lead toward greater friendship, which includes appreciation of differences that come down to basic intuitions or how we were raised or the shifting concerns in life. And what's most important to you has shifted over the years. And same thing is true for me. And also, I'm impressed with the day in this respect. Dr. Chica is a beginning theologian who's got a system that has as much stuff in it as we do. We've been at it for a long time. And the difference between a young person's work and an old person's work, I have discovered, has depended an awful lot on who your friends are and who you can debate. So it's been, debating with process theologians, especially you, has been really important for the cultivation and nuancing of, and self-clarification of my own view. So I advocate friendship as the context for this.
Beautiful. Amen. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking the three panelists.